Welcome to Dubrovnik, Croatia, and our final day on the cruise ship for our honeymoon. Very bittersweet, but also a very beautiful day. Due to the obvious time changes, we were up pretty early yet again. We weren't actually pulling into the port for Dubrovnik until around 6 in the morning. So I think it was around 5 or so when I was filming this. We were just sitting out on the balcony enjoying these absolutely stunning views, as well as several mega yachts and a few adorable sailboats coming into the harbor, the bay area. And it was just unbelievably beautiful, especially once the sun started rising and it was hitting all of the buildings. It was only a brief moment because there were storm clouds pretty much everywhere that day, and we got extremely fortunate that by the time we were going into the port itself, they had pretty much all dissipated. So our whole day in Dubrovnik was actually a very sunny, very toasty day. By 8 or so in the morning, we had ventured out to go get breakfast and made our way down to the shuttle bus to take you down to Old Town of Dubrovnik, which is where all the city walls are, and essentially most of the tourist attractions, including the cable car that goes all the way up to the top. Unfortunately, we never actually got to go on said cable car. We were there before the cable car opened up in the morning, and then by the time it had opened, the line was longer than we had available to wait before we had to return back to the cruise ship, unfortunately. But we were able to spend pretty much the majority of the morning with the city all to ourselves. I think this is in part because we tend to take the path less traveled and find some of the odd ways that you can get to and from certain places, such as some of the old city wall fortress buildings that you can see that we were walking past here. I believe this is the second part of the wall that's different than what we were later climbing on. And then from that, we were able to just essentially venture down a lot of the city streets. Everything is pedestrian friendly, at least as far as the old town goes. So we just ventured around exploring all the little pathways, seeing people's homes and little shops. And eventually later on in the day, we had even stumbled across a farmer's market, actually a couple farmers markets now that I think about it. And we're able to just look around at all the local produce, which for me is super fun since my major was nutrition and I just have a huge love of food. Here we are at the Dubrovnik Cathedral and Treasury there in the back, and then St. Blaise's Church here in the front, which we are now inside of. But I wanted to say, if you are a history nerd or an architecture buff in the slightest, then walking around just Dubrovnik's Old Town is going to be so interesting for you, because you have the medieval architecture in a lot of the churches and monasteries and things like that. But then more of the public buildings, I would say, are kind of in a Baroque style. I may be very wrong on that, but that's just to my knowledge what this architecture style is. And if you just look around anywhere on the city streets, you're going to find something interesting to look at. Quite frankly, I think one of the best things you could do is just stroll around and try to find all of the little details that you may have otherwise walked past. I mean, even the streets themselves, they are just the most smooth stone streets you have probably ever walked on. So speaking of which, be careful. But as we walked around the city, we found many churches and monasteries, a lot of which had shrines to Jesus. On our way to some of the Game of Thrones highlights, there are so many Game of Thrones walking tours. I'm pretty sure even without signing up for one, you could probably just overhear what they're talking about. But for all you fans out there, there are obviously many sites within Dubrovnik where the show was shot. Speaking of which are the stairs where the Walk of Shame occurred. But on our way over there, we passed yet another farmer's market, and I just wanted to point out, I don't know if this is all of Europe, but in my experience so far, it seems to me that all of the produce and everything just tastes so much fresher and more flavorful there than it ever does here in the United States. That may just be due to our growing practices here, and or I'm assuming this is a local farmer's market, and I would assume that the produce wasn't grown too far from where this market is being held. But anyways, back to the stairs. I was entirely shocked to find that we had this all to ourselves, but I was also a little bit shocked because in the scene from the show itself, it just seems empty there, but when you think about it, all of the architecture that's now there is a lot of local shops, cafes. I just couldn't picture that from the show, so it was kind of fun to see just everyday Dubrovnik as it is, opposed to how it was depicted in the Game of Thrones series. We got lost in the streets of Dubrovnik for quite a while longer, just exploring around, enjoying the city, finding some of the lesser known areas. We even saw some of the local kids playing street soccer on what appeared to be a basketball court. And then there were so many local cats, I'm assuming they're strays, I don't know, but they were just everywhere amongst Dubrovnik. And so we just kept exploring for a while until we eventually made our way on over to the city walls of Dubrovnik. FYI, during their tour season, there is a charge applied. I don't remember exactly how many it is, but you will need tuna available for that. And so once we were up on the walls, you just had the most breathtaking views of the city, especially with the way the light bounced off the rooftops. The other thing with these walls is I think they were originally constructed due to the fact that Dubrovnik was a city of refuge, and so a lot of the surrounding people would come to Dubrovnik fleeing from war-torn and conflict-torn areas at the time. And so these walls stretch almost the entirety of the old town of Dubrovnik, which I believe is almost 7,000 feet, maybe a little bit under, around 6,800 feet long. And so there's quite a lot of walls to walk. There are also segments of the walls that included public restrooms, some of the cannon stations. You have a great view of the water and the sailboats and everything in the surrounding areas. So that's just something to keep in mind. I will also say that the walls are made out of limestone, and since they are heavily treaded with tourists as well as those throughout history, they can be quite worn down in some areas, and just another heads up that yet again they can be quite slick. But we absolutely adored our time on the walls. They can get quite crowded, especially later on in the day, like when we went. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you can go earlier, that would be to your benefit. I also think that the fee may be waived depending on what time you get up on the walls. There are also quite a few bars, cafes, and restaurants up on the wall as well, including, I believe, a few artists. I know when we were there were some that were selling hand-painted ornaments for like a Christmas tree, as well as little trinkets and hand-embroidered scenes from Dubrovnik, as well as many paintings from around the town. So just something to keep in mind if you are looking for a little souvenir to take back home. There will be an abundant supply of options up on top of the wall and or immediately getting off the wall as well. We rounded out the remainder of our time here in Dubrovnik, getting a coffee at one of the coffee shops immediately after when you get off of the steps, and then walking on over to what some people refer to as the tourist promenade, also formerly known as the Stradun, because there were a lot more shops and cafes and restaurants that were open now that weren't open earlier, as you could probably tell by the clips earlier in this episode, because the streets were completely barren. We had it pretty much all to ourselves. And now there were people in every seat available at most of the restaurants. Most of the cafes were busy. But luckily we did find a off the beaten path little ice cream cafe and creperie. So we picked up a very delicious strawberry crepe to go enjoy out by the water before we eventually made our way back on over to the boat, as it was ending our time here in Dubrovnik. So for the remainder of the day, we pretty much enjoyed our last little bit of time on the cruise ship. We spent a little bit of time up on the sports deck, kicking around the soccer ball like we used to in the good old days. And then we eventually watched as the boat pulled out of the port, which was actually quite interesting since the boat is massive. There was quite the ordeal trying to back out of where we were docked. That way you could avoid hitting the bridge and then get back out of this little channel that we seemed to have found our way through. But that's it for our time in Dubrovnik, as well as pretty much our time on our honeymoon as well. Very bittersweet to think we waited a year past getting married, and then obviously the 6+ years of dating to get to this point. And I'm sure this is just one of many hopefully amazing memories and just love-filled life here to come. And so just wanted to say how thankful and blessed I am for this time that we had on this boat. We got to see and experience so many new things as a couple, and I just couldn't be more thankful. So that's it for today, and tomorrow we will make our way back on over to the Venice airport to eventually find our way back home in Kentucky. So thank you guys for watching. Hope you have a wonderful day.